Cronos The New Dawn is a brand new Unreal Engine 5 horror game that's been very well received, but it can be quite a bit demanding. In this video, we'll test the game's scalability and take it from a 4K 20 to 30 FPS experience all the way to 4K 120 without much of a difference to image quality and without frame generation. Cronos The New Dawn is a new original IP by the Bloober Team, the makers of The Medium, which was quite a unique take on the horror genre, one I quite liked actually. They also did the Silent Hill 2 remake, which was good, but plagued with some performance issues. It's safe to say this specialty is immersing players in a suspenseful environment, and Cronos The New Dawn does do that, but their previous games have been plagued by some performance issues like stuttering, for example, and this one is actually an improvement in that regard. I still don't think this level of performance warrants the visuals on screen. For example, this game can be more demanding than Metal Gear Solid Delta with all the settings maxed out, and I don't think it looks as highly detailed. What do you guys think? Let me know. And for this video, I'll be using my RTX 4090 and 9800X3D system, which is high-end, but we're also targeting 4K. But the same graphical profiles that we'll be going over should scale the same way on other hardware. Now let's step out of the vault and dive straight into it. We'll start off at the very top at native 4K with hardware ray tracing enabled and the epic quality preset. Now we have a good sample of areas in the game here with this benchmark run. Starting outdoors, as you can see, we're able to get between 30 and 40 FPS. Now for Unreal Engine 5, this is quite heavy compared to other games, but performance can vary quite a bit between areas because, as you'll see, once we enter the indoors, now we're dropping into the low 30s and into the 20s sometimes. But from what I've played so far, which isn't a lot, the gameplay consists of outdoor areas, indoor areas, and then nest areas where there's a lot of enemies that you have to fight. As far as stuttering goes in this game, it's actually way better than the Medium was, way better than Silent Hill 2. However, there can be some hitching with traversal stuttering sometimes, especially when you open a door or something. But the most demanding areas in the game have to be the nests, which can vary in size and complexity, but this one here is actually a lot of enemies coming towards you and a lot going on, explosions. But if you look at the frame rate, right, we started with 30 to 40 FPS outdoors, and then we dropped into the 30s, mid-20s indoors, and then here we're below 20 FPS, guys. We're in the teens. This is really a challenge to play with a mouse and keyboard, I tell you. But the biggest culprit when it comes to performance costs with this game is hardware lumen. If you disable hardware lumen, you can actually gain a lot of performance back. So here, let me show you. We're gonna go ahead and disable hardware ray tracing. Everything else remains the same. Native 4K, epic graphical preset. In the same outdoor area previously, we were in the mid to high 30s. Now we're in the mid 50s. That is a pretty big gain in performance, guys. It could be around 40 to 30% or so. Big gain in performance. And if you follow my channel at all, you'll know that I'm a pretty big fan of ray tracing. I've been very open about it. I like the technology. I think it can transform visuals a lot. I like my eye candy. But in this game, guys, I even set out wanting to do a maybe hardware lumen on versus hardware lumen off. Those are videos that do very well in my channel, and I like doing them. But I couldn't really notice a big difference in image quality, even looking closely a bit. Difference is not massive, but the performance cost really is. That difference in performance is even bigger once you drop down into the nest, because if you'll remember, previously we were in the teens, sometimes hitting 14 to 15 FPS. We've essentially more than doubled our FPS in this area, which is crazy. It goes to show that the ray tracing effects, hardware versus software lumen in this area is a lot greater than the outdoors area, where we saw about a 40 to 50% gain, give or take. So clearly, whatever they're doing in this area with these enemies and maybe with the flesh, maybe they're using some sort of a transparency on skin, it's quite possible that that is what's happening, but clearly you stand to gain a lot of performance just by disabling hardware lumen, which visually does not make a very big difference in my opinion. But that's not all. There is a couple things that we can do to gain some more performance before we have to use some upscaling. I did end up going through the graphical settings individually, just briefly, to see what type of performance I could squeeze before I have to use upscaling. Now, I'm no benchmarking, but the settings I found to have impact on performance was shadow quality and shaders quality. So the biggest performance gain you will see is by dropping from high to medium and shaders quality from high to medium. And right there, we're already pushing into the 60s. If you remember previously here, we were in the low 50s. So that is a pretty good gain. Again, like I said, the other settings, I didn't see much of an increase in performance. Shadow quality and shaders quality was the two settings I found worth messing around with. And even indoors, guys, as you can see, we did hit 70 there for a brief moment, but we're into the 60s. Moving forward into the more demanding inside area of this benchmark run, we still remain very close to 60, guys, and the game still looks just as good to my eye. Maybe if you put them side by side, you'd be able to notice the difference, but I still think the game looks just as immersive. And once we enter the nest, surprisingly, guys, we see a very big gain in performance just by lowering shadows and shaders quality in this area. So it looks like this area, these nest areas, are what's most affected by any settings changes, be it hardware versus software lumen or reducing shadows and shaders quality. So the shaders quality seem to make quite a big impact in performance, especially in this area. But this is about as much performance we can squeeze out without having to use any upscaling. So for those that like to play at native 4K, I would recommend using shadow and shader quality to medium and software lumen. I tried going to low with shaders and shadows, and it didn't make much of a difference in FPS for me. So that's why I think medium is probably a better idea. But personally, I have no problem with using upscaling. So let's up the FPS some more, shall we? Whenever I play on my 4K display, I always like to use DLSS performance because it does such a good job, and for this game it's kind of necessary, especially with hardware ray tracing on and the epic quality presets. So again, we start with maxed out everything but with DLSS performance, and the beginning looks very promising. We're in the mid 70s. Great. Without DLSS here, we would be in the mid to low 30s. So that is a big difference. Making our way inside, it still holds up relatively well. We do drop into the 50s sometimes, but for the most part, it remains between a 50 to 60 FPS experience. I would consider 50 to 60 with VRR to be a 60 FPS experience. But once we enter this area, before entering the nest, that is kind of where the 60 FPS experience begins to crumble a bit. Because again, that hardware ray tracing in these nest areas has a much bigger cost than in other areas. And you can see that here, right? We started with 75 FPS outdoors to 60 indoors, and now we're into the 50s, high 40s sometimes in the nest area of the game with ray tracing enabled, hardware ray tracing. So yeah, guys, even on a 4090 at 4K with DLSS performance, you're gonna have to make some sacrifices if you want to keep that hardware ray tracing enabled, like try to lower the shadow and shaders quality to medium. But personally, again, I don't think it's really worth even using the hardware ray tracing option, because you stand to gain a lot more performance while the game practically looks the same. So let's go ahead and turn that ray tracing off. DLSS performance still with the epic graphical preset. And the performance gains, guys, is immediately right there. We went from mid 70s to 100 FPS, guys. Massive gains just using software lumen. Now, one thing I didn't mention or talk much about was the CPU usage. It actually seems to be okay. Again, if you paid attention, from what I've noticed anyways, that using hardware ray tracing can make the game a bit more stuttery. Now, I don't know if you have a weaker CPU. Maybe that is even worse. but it appears that Software Lumen not only benefits you in getting more FPS, but also a smoother frame time. At least from my experience anyway, the 1% lows seem to be a little bit better. But look at that, guys. We are in the hundreds here. And the difference between native 4K and DLSS performance, I mean, maybe there are some differences if you pay close attention, side by side maybe, but to me the game still looks just as crisp, just as clean, just as good as native 4K did. So that is why personally I don't mind using upscaling, because it's a tool that has value and it makes a big difference in performance. And for this game, with a mouse and keyboard like I like to play it, I mean, this is the type of performance that I want to have, and it feels great to play. Now if we drop down to hell, where the performance gets the worst, we actually still remain very close to 90, guys. Not a big difference, because again, that hardware ray tracing seems to have a much higher cost in these areas, in these nest areas, with all these monsters running around. So disabling that is a pretty big advantage, as you can see. So if you were playing without the frame rate counter, dropping from 100, 110 to 90 is not really a big difference. It is noticeable a bit when you play with a mouse and keyboard, of course, but it still feels very good to play. And I even noticed in my gameplay I was doing better getting a higher frame rate, obviously, than getting less. I'd say that for me, this is the minimum profile that I would use playing this game. But we can do a little bit better, because personally, I'd like to be able to get close to 100 FPS on the worst case scenario areas. So let's see what we can do. Now this here is going to be my preferred profile. 4K, Software Lumen, DLSS performance, and we're going to go and set shadow quality and shader quality to medium from high. The performance increase is truly noticeable. As you can see, we are well above the 100s in the outdoors area, but moving indoors where the game does or can become a little bit more demanding, we remain above 100 FPS, and this feels very, very nice to play with a mouse and keyboard, of course. Now, I don't know about you guys, but to me, the image quality looks pretty much the same, whether shaders and shadow is on high or medium. The game still looks really good. Let's make our way down into the nest where the performance cost is the greatest. And if you'll remember previously, we were hovering around 80 to 90 FPS at times. And as you can see, now we remain above 100 FPS. Now, this type of gameplay experience would be perfect if you had a 4K, 120 Hz OLED TV or something like that with VRR. This is extremely smooth. And as you can see, the frame time, 1% lows this whole time is 80 FPS, guys. That is very close to average. That is a sign of the game running really well. And for me, this is my preferred profile. Now you might say, well, we also have frame generation. Personally, I'm not a big fan of it in this game, and I will show you exactly why. But it comes down to responsiveness, which is quite important in a game like this. I mean, it might be a bit slow-paced, but when you encounter a bunch of enemies running around, it's actually quite satisfying. You stay on the move, reload your guns, try to use the environment to your advantage, whether it be line of sight or explosive barrels and stuff like that. And I think that frame generation kind of gets in the way of that. Frame generation. We were already getting 120 FPS with our previous profile, my favorite profile. And with frame generation enabled, well, that takes us up towards 180 FPS or so. So we essentially gained around 60, let's say 70 more FPS in image fluidity, which, yes, I am using a 240 Hz display, so I would stand to benefit from the improved visual fluidity. However, what we have lost here is responsiveness and increased latency, because we had a game that looked and felt like 120 FPS, which is fantastic, for a game that looks like 160 FPS but feels like 80 FPS, if that makes sense. So for me anyway, frame generation in this game doesn't really make much sense. I will not be using it, but to each their own. Anyway, to wrap everything up, Cronos The New Dawn may just be the most graphically demanding game that Bloober Team has released, and yet it's the smoothest at the same time, with Unreal Engine 5's stutter struggle kept at a minimum. Gameplay-wise, it's more Dead Space than anything else, and while it didn't click with me at first, it kinda grew on me. The sound direction is quite good. I'd recommend headphones, by the way. The game looks quite good, although not great, and I find the black levels to be a bit too high on my OLED display. But the gameplay itself actually feels quite good battling the enemies. It's quite enjoyable. Now, while the game can be very demanding, as I showed in this video, there is some scalability. Mostly you'll have to use FSR or DLSS, which, hey, has become the norm these days, unfortunately. Now when it comes to the graphic settings, there isn't a lot there, but dropping shadows and shaders quality from high to medium will award you some extra performance, especially in the more demanding areas. Now, I would be curious to see how the game does on some of my weaker hardware, like the RTX 5060 or 9060 XT, but I guess we'll see how this video does. Anyway, I hope you all have a great weekend, and give the video a like if you liked it. Peace.